Today's story is the original Cinderella, or The Little Glass Slipper, originally written by Charles Perrault. There once was a noble widower who remarried, taking a second wife who was stuck up and proud, as in the world. She brought with her two daughters who looked exactly like her and shared the same bad character. Now the husband also had a young daughter, but she was full of unmatched gentleness and kindness, which she got from her mother, who was the finest person in the world. As soon as the wedding was over, the stepmother began to reveal her bad temper. She found the good qualities of this young child unbearable, especially since they showed her how odious her own girls were. She put her to the most menial work in the house. She had to wash the dishes, clean the table, and clean her mother in law's bedroom and those of her daughters, addressing them as Madame and Mrs. She slept in a bare attic on a bed of straw, while her sisters enjoyed rooms with parquet floors, with the most fashionable beds and long mirrors where they could admire themselves from top to bottom. The poor girl bore it all patiently and never dared to complain to her father, who would have scolded her, so completely was he ruled by his wife. Whenever she had finished her work, she would go to the corner of the fireplace and sit in the ashes. And so she came to be called Cinder Girl. But the youngest sister, who was not as rude as the eldest, called her Cinderella. But even with her filthy garments, Cinderella was easily 100 times more beautiful than her sisters, for all their lovely clothes. It happened one day that the king's son was giving a ball and invited all the people of quality to come. The two misses were invited as well, since they were figures of high society in that country. They were thrilled by the invitations and got to work choosing out their gowns, petticoats, and hair dressings that would suit them best. This was all an extra burden for Cinderella, since it fell to her to iron her sisters' linen and pleat their ruffles. All day long they talked of how they would dress. I, said the eldest, will wear my red velvet gown with an English trim. And I, said the youngest, will just have my ordinary petticoat, but that will work out because I will put on my cloak with the gold flowers and my diamond bodice, which will make it all very fancy. They sent for the best hairdressers to prepare their hairpieces and adjust their curls, and they bought combs from the finest designer. They called Cinderella to ask her opinion, for she had excellent taste, and gave them superb advice, even offering to comb their hair, which they accepted. As she was styling them, they told her, Cinderella, wouldn't you like to go to the ball? Oh, ladies, you are just making fun of me. That is not something I can have. You're right, they said. Think how they would laugh to see a Cinder girl go to the ball. Any other girl in Cinderella's place would have sabotaged their hairdos, but she was very virtuous and did them up perfectly. The sisters were so determined to be slender that they had hardly eaten in 2 days, and they broke more than a dozen laces tightening their dresses to force themselves into a smaller size. And they were constantly in front of the mirror. When the happy day arrived at last, they departed, and Cinderella followed them with her eyes as far as she could see. When they were finally out of sight, she began to weep. Her godmother saw her all in tears and asked her what the matter was. I wish, I wish, I. She was crying so hard she could not finish. Her godmother, who was a fairy, said, You'd like to go to the ball, wouldn't you? Oh, yes, said Cinderella, sobbing. Well, said her godmother, will you be a good girl when I take you there? She led her into the room and said, Go into the garden and bring me a pumpkin. Cinderella had no idea how a pumpkin could help her go to the ball, but she went at once to pick out her best one and brought it to her godmother. Her godmother scooped out the pumpkin's insides, leaving nothing but the shell. Then she struck it with her wand, and the pumpkin was instantly changed into a fine gold coach. Then she took a look into her mouse trap, where she found 6 mice, all alive. She told Cinderella to lift the trap door just a bit, and as each mouse came out, she gave it a knock with her wand, and the mouse was immediately turned into a fine horse. This made a great team of 6 horses with a beautiful dappled gray mouse color. But there was still no coachman, so Cinderella said, I'll check if we have a rat in the rat trap that we can make into a coachman. Good thinking, said her godmother. Go look. Cinderella brought her the trap with the 3 large rats in it. The fairy picked out the one with the largest beard and touched him with her wand. At once he was changed into a plump coachman with the most exquisite mustache you had ever seen. Then she said, Go into the garden. You'll see 6 lizards behind the watering can. Bring them to me. As soon as she had done this, her godmother turned them into 6 footmen, who immediately lined up behind the coach in decorous clothes, clinging close behind each other as if that was all they had ever done in their life. Then the fairy said to the Cinderella, Well, that looks ready to go to the ball. Do you like it? Yes, but do I have to go like this in my awful rags? With a mere touch of the wand, her godmother instantly turned her rags into cloth of gold and silver, all decked out in jewels. Then she gave her a pair of glass slippers, the loveliest in the world. Now that she was all dressed, she stepped into the coach. But her godmother ordered her, above all things, not to stay out past midnight, warning that if she remained at the ball for an instant more, her coach would turn back to a pumpkin, her horse to mice, her footmen to lizards, and her beautiful clothes would take back their original form. She promised her godmother she would not fail to leave the ball before midnight. Then she drove away, scarcely able to contain her joy. The king's son, who got word that a great princess whom nobody knew had just arrived, so he went out to welcome her. He gave her his hand, and she lighted from the coach and led her into the room where all the guests were. A great silence fell at once. Everyone stopped dancing, and the violin ceased playing, for everyone was swept up in admiration of this unknown stranger's beauty. Nothing was heard but a confused murmur. Ah, how beautiful she is! The king himself, old as he was, could not help but gaze on her and whisper to the queen how long it had been since he had seen such a beautiful and lovely person. All the ladies paid close attention to her hairstyle and clothes, planning to have something similar made the next day if only they could find such beautiful fabrics and designers who were skilled enough. The king's son escorted her to a seat of honor and before long took her to dance. She danced with such grace that everyone's admiration grew even more. A very fine meal was served, but the young prince ate nothing. He was so intent on gazing on her. She sat down with her sisters and paid them 1,000 courtesies. She gave them some of the oranges and lemons that the prince had given her, which amazed them coming from a stranger. While they were chatting, Cinderella heard the clock strike 11:45. So she immediately made a deep curtsy to the company and left as fast as she could. When she got home, she went to her godmother, thanked her, and then told her she longed to go to the ball again the next day because the king's son had invited her. And she was eagerly telling her godmother everything that had happened at the ball. Her two sisters knocked at the door. Cinderella ran to open it. Well, you took a long time getting back, she told them, yawning and rubbing her eyes and stretching as if she were just waking up. But of course, she had not been sleepy at all since they had gone. If you had come to the ball, said one of her sisters, you would never have tired of it. The most beautiful princess in the world was there, and she showed us 1,000 courtesies and gave us oranges and lemons. Cinderella concealed her joy and asked them the name of that princess, but they answered that they did not know, and that the king's son had become very anxious about her, and that he would give everything in the world to know who she was. Cinderella smiled and said, she must have been very beautiful to delight you so much. Couldn't I see her? Oh, Lady Charlotte, couldn't you lend me your yellow dress that you wear every day? Indeed, said Charlotte, I should give you my clothes to a filthy cinder girl like you. I would have to be a fool. Cinderella fully expected to be refused in this way, and she was glad, since she would have been quite embarrassed if her sister had kindly lent her that gown, which she had requested in jest. The next day the two sisters were at the ball, and Cinderella came too, but now dressed even more finely than the first time. The king's son was always at her side, praising her ceaselessly. All this was so very exciting for the young woman that she forgot her godmother's advice. She was sure it was no later than 11 when she heard the first strike of midnight. She got up and fled as nimble as a deer. The prince followed, but could not catch up to her. Yet she dropped one of the glass slippers, and the prince picked it up with great care. Cinderella arrived home out of breath. Her coach and footmen were gone, and her clothes were ragged. Nothing remained of her magnificent attire but one of the little slippers, the partner to the one she had dropped. The guests asked the palace guards if they had seen a princess go out of the palace gates. They said they had seen no one but a very poorly dressed girl who looked more like a peasant than a princess. When the two sisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked them if it had been entertaining and if the fine lady had been there. Yes, they told her, but she had run away at the stroke of midnight, and in her haste had dropped one of her little glass slippers, the loveliest on the earth, and that the king's son had picked it up. He had done nothing but gaze on her throughout the ball, and he was clearly deep in love with the beautiful owner of this small slipper. What they said was quite true, because a few days later the king's son had it proclaimed by the sound of a trumpet that he would marry no woman but she whose foot could fit into the slipper. At first they tested the princess, then the duchesses, and all the court, but to no avail. Then they brought in the two sisters, who did all they could to force their foot into the slipper, but could not succeed in the end. Cinderella watched, recognizing her own slipper, and she laughingly said, let me see if it will fit me. Her sisters burst into mocking laughter, but the gentleman who was trying the slippers on the girls looked seriously at Cinderella. found her beautiful, and declared it was only fair since he had orders to test every girl. He had Cinderella sit down, and as he put the slipper on her little foot, he found that it went on easily, fitting as perfectly as a wax model. The two sisters were utterly astonished, but even more so when Cinderella drew from her pocket the other little slipper and put it on her other foot. Just then her godmother appeared. She touched her wand to Cinderella's clothes, making them become even more beautiful than they had been before. Now her two sisters recognized her as the beautiful person they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon for all the abuse that they had made her suffer. Cinderella looked down and kissed them, saying she forgave them with all her heart, but she asked them to love her always. They took her to the young prince, dressed as she was. He found her the most beautiful that he'd ever seen, and a few days later he married her. Cinderella, who was good as she was beautiful, gave her two sisters a place to stay at the palace and married them to two great lords. The end. The moral of this story is to always be brave and kind, even in the face of adversary.